This
Gaming is.
conference will now be recorded.
You all know that the National Center for Responsible Gaming is an industry funded organization that is providing money for some research and various other things. They hold a conference and that sort of thing. So one of the things that to me is always important with research is that you, especially with gambling, is that you identify where the money flow is coming from, because this is an addiction that is about money. I mean, we say it's not about the money, but it absolutely is about the money. And I think you guys have heard me say on more than one occasion that I believe that this addiction affects and infects in some way everyone at multiple layers and multiple levels. So with that disclosure, I thought a couple of the things he wrote a little article here based on some research that he did, and the title of his piece, and this was just looks like it was just published. Yeah, the date August 13th, 2018, which I guess was yesterday. He said, "Designed to deceive: how gambling distorts reality and hooks your brain." So what I've noticed is there's more and more people looking at that phenomena, and here's just a few of the things that he says. He said, "When I ask my psychology students why they think people gamble, the most frequent suggestions are for pleasure, money, or the thrill." And so what that brings to mind is our question that's always front and center stage when we're working with people with gambling problems or drug problems. Doesn't really matter, but the question is, what function does your gambling serve? And it's easy to apply the labels of escape and well, they're in action. Well, it's escape, and those are both true. But if we just leave it at that, then we really have nothing, because what we want to know is operationally, what problem is that person trying to solve, or what is it that they're looking for that they don't have, that they believe that their gambling is going to provide for them. I think that's a clinical question that is front and foremost and stays in center stage, and it may have multiple answers at multiple levels, and it may change for individuals over time. But he goes on to say, he said, while these may be the reasons why people gamble initially, psychologists don't definitely know why, for some, gambling stops being an enjoyable diversion and becomes compulsive. That's the why do some people become addicted and others don't? Uh, why stick with games people know are designed for them to lose? Are some people just more unlucky than the rest of us, or simply worse at calculating odds? And then he talks about he's been an addiction researcher for 15 years, and he's looking at the brain. I look at the brain to understand the hooks that make gambling so compelling. I found that many are intentionally hidden in how the games are designed. And that part of that gets at Natasha Schull's book, Addiction by Design, where she talks about the intentional design of the casinos to help people or to assist people in not leaving the casino, which I guess is a nice way of saying that. Then he goes on to say, he says, uncertainty as its own reward in the brain. That's the heading. So he's really focusing on the aspect of gambling that is uncertain. And what we've talked about before is, yes, there is uncertainty, but there is also absolute certainty. It's unambiguous, and he doesn't go into this distinction. But remember, the outcome of a way, and I think life is much more complicated than that. And if we try and reduce it down to black and white, win or lose, all or nothing, we simply have what seems to be going on in a lot of places in this country today, and it seems to be pretty unhealthy and chaotic. So in the midst of the uncertainty, there is absolute certainty. just to clarify that. So he goes on and he says, reward uncertainty plays a crucial role in gambling's attraction. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter the brain releases during enjoyable activities such as eating, sex, and drugs, is also released during situations where the reward is uncertain. In fact, dopamine release increases particularly during the moments leading up to a potential reward. All right, so all that's simply a researcher's way of talking about, what you guys have heard me talk about for years, and is written in the Combo book in 1957, The Dream World of the Gambler. That it is all about anticipation. And I think it's important that we keep going back to that over and over and over again. And I don't care where somebody is in their gambling or their recovery process. I think if we really get and if we really understand that where most gamblers are, I would say all of us until we become conscious of doing life different, even if we stop gambling, still live in that place where we're living ahead of where we are. We're living out into the future. I was talking to a guy that I work with who's a successful businessman. He's in the medical profession, but he's also a very good businessman, which is a bit of a contradiction in terms because most are not. And he's not gambling, but he's still operating his business with the mind of the gambler. He's still chasing. He's chasing more and more business. He's got to expand. He's got to keep expanding. And what we talked about in the language of the Combo book, there never seems to be enough winnings to make even the smallest dream come true. Or for addicts, whatever it is never enough. And so we take all those characteristics that are true for an individual while they're in action and understand that many of those are still the dynamics that you're going to be working with your clients, with your patients on in the recovery process. So anybody, as I'm kind of mouthing off, jump in anytime with a question or tell me to slow down or whatever. So
perfect opportunity. I wanted to jump in right there, Chris.
Go ahead, jump.
Just speaking, because I've wondered about seeing that a few different times with folks about how they do their business opportunities, and I may have even mentioned it on here before. I think I always have a significant number of car salespeople on my caseload at any given time, but I've noticed it in other regards. That one always seems, the concept of the win, how that whole industry is structured. But I've got another person now who just quit being a car salesperson, but is putting similar energy into her. There's an overall term for these kind of businesses, but she sells nutrition products and she's done Mary Kay and that kind of thing. These entrepreneurial marketing schemes. Maybe schemes isn't the right word. And so consequently, just seeing how the gambling aspect of the win of the sale and all this, how that plays into that and that connection is something I think I've been seeing more and more and more.
Okay, and in the instance you're talking about, it's most clear in those, and that's why I say that gambling is the great metaphor for much of life. It's certainly, Wall Street is all based on not what you did yesterday, but the value that we assign to any individual security. If it's an equity, if it's stock in a company, is not based on what was done yesterday, but what we think is going to happen tomorrow. That drives what people are willing to pay for a stock. And so I think that way of thinking is, again, it's I love. To me, gambling is so elegant, and I believe for a long time, if we understand, then that helps us understand all kinds of things. So here's the way that I conceptualize that. Clearly, and I sold. It's funny you mentioned cars. I sold cars when I was in college, and it was crazy. It was a crazy place, and I learned a lot. about how the world works. And this was in the early 1970s, before the car business was really more regulated like it is today. So, but yeah, in the car business, you're always betting on the come, in a sense. You're always looking forward to the next deal, the next deal, the next deal, the next deal. And I think that's true with many people in life. And so, on one hand, there's nothing wrong with that, because that's the way it is. And you all know that for most people, if they're in sales, they're given sales quotas, and there's all kinds of pressure to meet the sales quota, and so we're always looking forward. So that's baked in, and yet what's missing is a sense of I think this distinction between fantasy and vision. And I know we've talked about that, but it certainly bears repeating. So when I'm talking about this, I remember years and years ago at a GA conference in Chicago, we were talking about this, and the guy said, "Well, to your point, John." The guy says, "Well, I'm in sales, and I'm always looking. They tell me to. Here's a typical sales strategy. Imagine getting into your head, visualizing the sale, visualizing what you're going to do with the money that you make from the sale, and as if that's going to motivate people to then go do the grunt work to actually pick up the phone and cold call and get rejected and make the sale." Well, the fact is it doesn't. But he said, "This is what they've taught me to do." I said, "Well, did they also teach you to go spend the money before you even picked up the phone to make the sales call?" And he laughed and he said, "Well, no." So the question is, where am I living inside of myself? In other words, yeah, I know that I need to make the sale, and in I think the what is it, pyramid marketing, or maybe I think there's another word for what you're describing.
Multi-level.
Multi-level marketing. Yeah, and there's people who do really well with that. But here's the distinction between the people who do well and the people who don't, I think, is that, let me see how I can say this in the simplest way possible. If I'm living in fantasy, then what I'm doing is I am attaching feelings to outcomes. I am attaching feelings to events that have not yet occurred. By contrast, if I'm living in vision, I'm not giving myself the feeling reward of having done something, like having made the sale, until I actually make the sale. That's a critical distinction. So let me say it again. So this is a process of discernment, and it's part of what you all as clinicians, because every one of you is going to run into situations. You're already in the middle of situations like this, because most everybody you work with, if they have the gambling problem or if they're an addict at all, they're not living in the present. They're either stuck in the past or they're out in the future. Neither one can we do anything about. If you're treating somebody that has an anxiety disorder, by my understanding of what anxiety is this fear of that which hasn't occurred, which means out in the future. And so our challenge is to help people identify that and bring them back into the present moment. In other words, and the program says, what do? We live one day at a time. Well, what does that mean? Well, it may mean a 24-hour period, but at its deeper meaning, it's we live where we are. We do things one step at a time, the next right things first, one step at a time, one day at a time. So there's all the wisdom out of AA that says that's an invitation to move into the present moment. Now, again, our job as clinicians is to help the people we're working with identify where they are living inside their head and their body. You living into the disaster that has not yet occurred. Oh God, I'm afraid that I didn't do my work. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job and blah blah blah. And okay, well, tell me what's going on that you're not doing your work. I
Chris,
could
I
get,
got a question.
shoot, jump in.
So how do you differentiate this between, say, hope, which is also future oriented, but
Yeah,
hope is generally considered a positive thing?
yeah. That's it. I was having a talk with somebody about that yesterday. Um, I think hope is, we think in terms of hope out in the future. I mean, and you're right. I think that's typically, but I think what the challenge in your question is to redefine or really look at when we're talking about hope. I could say, well, I hope to win the lottery. Now that would be one use of the term. What I would suggest is that has nothing to do with hope. That's somebody living in fantasy. In other words, I'm getting juiced. I feel good in thinking about winning the lottery. I haven't won it. That's a dissociative process. That's getting high off the fantasy. So part of my answer is we confuse hope with what I'm referring to really as fantasy. I don't think that's hope. I think hope is a posture that says that it's another way of saying that. Some people say, "Don't worry about tomorrow. God is already there." That's some people's representation. Or I really don't need to be concerned about tomorrow. I mean, if I've got a bill I got to pay or something needs to be done, obviously you take care of business. But hope, I believe, leaves us free to live fully in the present. It's not about being out in the future. And I live with a sense of with a sense of hope. And for me, the discussion I was having yesterday is that sense that the world, in the midst of all of its unsafety, all of the craziness, all of the bad stuff that happens, that the world is still a good place. It's a safe place in the midst of there being things that are not safe. For me, hope means that I don't need to spend time worrying about what's going to happen tomorrow. I can only do what I can do, and I'm free to live fully into today. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of challenging how we normally use the word hope. And I think that most of the time when we use the word hope, that we are jumping out into the future, and that we're living into some place that frankly doesn't exist. That may not be a good answer, so respond to what you hear me saying.
No, I think that helps, and I think that makes sense. And my question comes from working with clients in a gambling group and
Right.
talking to them about where they're at when they're going into the casino. And one of the clients had used that word, hope.
Right.
I'm going in with this sense of hope. I hope I win.
Yeah.
But I think
Yeah.
that distinction is really beneficial. That it's not so much of a hope, that it is more of that fantasy-driven mentality.
That's right. Absolutely, because the reason I'm going into the casino, what I'm doing is, and of course, and you may already do this, but I would say, so when you're walking into the casino, what is the story you're telling yourself in your head?
Mm-hmm.
And I almost guarantee you that what they're imagining is winning. In other words, if they tell themselves before they even leave the house to go to the casino, you know what, if I go there, it's a rigged game, it's a loser's game, and yeah, I might win, but knowing me, if I win, I'm just going to piss it all away and then some. And then I'm going to beat the crap out of myself. Then the probability of them going to the casino, I would argue, is greatly diminished. So the only reason somebody's going to go to the casino is if they have the hope, which actually is what I'm calling the fantasy of winning. I also think that people, and I'm thinking of addicts in recovery, or addicts. Let's say you're working with an addict in treatment, and I know I experienced this, somewhat often where somebody in my office, something will occur and there'll be some kind of breakthrough. And what I watch, nothing has changed in the past, nothing has changed in the future, but something has shifted internally. And I watch somebody move from a place of despair to a place of hope. Now, in that case, I would say, when I tell myself my life will never get better, then I think my affective experience is probably going to be some kind of despair. But if I tell myself life can be better, and the reason that I can say to myself that life can be better is because I just experienced something different right here in the moment inside of myself. And so then the felt experience of that would be hope, but it occurs because something shifts in the moment. It doesn't occur because I'm attached to the outcome of something in the future. I'm saying in the moment, and the reason that I believe that my life will be better is because actually I'm experiencing a better life right here and right now. I don't have to wait for it. It's happening right now. So that's what I'm saying. I think hope comes from the reality of present moment experience. And again, it's one of those things that's really tough to wrestle with because we use hope in so many different ways. And so often, especially for gamblers, we use that in place of fantasy. But it's a critical question for you guys as clinicians to parse that out with somebody. And so when you hear the client say, I hope I win, how do you respond to that typically in your sessions? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm just processing. My knee-jerk reaction would probably be to ask for more. Like, what does that hope look like?
Okay.
When you say hope, what does that mean to you?
Beautiful. Perfect. And what do you hear them say? Typically, you can kind of make something up, but it's kind of the variations on a theme.
I'm trying to think back to this. I don't remember exactly how it played out in the group session where this came up, but we did get around to that point where the client was able to say, hope is fantasy. They were able to equate that moment with the fantasy.
Beautiful. Then you got it. You did it. And of course, the other thing is when they're walking in the casino hoping that they're going to win, how are they feeling?
Right.
Probably pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a little bit of anxiety, especially if they've had the experience. I've been here before, and I know I can get my ass kicked again, but maybe this time will be different.
Right.
It's kind of like somebody. I think you guys have. Some of you heard me do the kind of ridiculous lottery ticket thing when you ask a group of people how many in this room have bought a lottery ticket, and most, especially in lottery stuff, most people have. And inevitably, I'll have somebody who hardly ever buys lottery tickets. So I buy, once every now and then, but I never win. I'm completely unlucky. I never win anything. Okay, but why'd you buy the lottery ticket? Well, no, actually, I don't know. Why'd you buy the lottery ticket? Well, if you don't buy a lottery ticket, you can't win. What do you mean? Who's you? Who are you talking about? So even the person who tells themselves, who doesn't have a gambling problem, who hardly ever buys lottery tickets, even the person who tells themselves, I'm the unluckiest person alive, I never win anything, the only reason that they buy a lottery ticket is because they have a belief, which is true, that they might win. And so in your question, you did a beautiful job in asking them to make this abstract concept that we call hope. You had them make it operational, and you sound like you did a beautiful job in walking them through that. So as you recall, after they recognized that it was a fantasy, do you remember what happened next?
Not exactly. We came around and we were I don't remember exactly what they said, but we ended up differentiating between hoping and thinking.
Okay.
And so we had this conversation about what those looked like, how they were different, and how that difference played out in relation to gambling and going to the casino.
Okay. What I love and what you're talking about is that you're helping people get into their heads to think about their own thinking, which is precisely, I believe, what we have to do with gamblers. And you're helping them become conscious of their own thinking. In other words, you're helping them wake up. And when you do that, that takes them to the place of then intervening on themselves. You're leading them into a place where you're inviting them to confront themselves. And as we've said, maybe most every time, it's not when somebody else confronts me that I do something different. It's only when I confront myself. And so our job as a clinician is to do exactly what you did and walk people into a place where they have an opportunity to confront themselves. You're just the guy kind of holding up the mirror and replaying the tape recorder for them, and sometimes amplifying it, and sometimes blocking some other stuff out. So that's great. That's great stuff. You got it. And I would say that when you're working with gamblers in that way, then you're being a damn fine clinician. That's a category, by the way. So to substantiate what we're talking about, anybody else on that right yet? Thanks for throwing that in, because that's what we're talking about. I think is really foundational concerns, issues when we're working with gamblers. So this guy, here's the way a research psychologist talks about what you and I are talking about, more in kind of a clinical application way. So he says, one of the hallmarks of gambling is its uncertainty, whether it's the size of the jackpot or the probability of winning at all. And reward uncertainty, that's a phrase that he uses, reward uncertainty plays a crucial role in gambling's attraction. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter the brain releases during enjoyable activities such as eating, sex, and drugs, is also released during situations where the reward is uncertain. Reward clearly is not past, it's not present, it's out in the future, either in the next millisecond in the case of a machine play, or the next few hours in the case of sports betting, or whatever it happens to be. Clearly, he's talking about the future when he was talking about reward uncertainty. In fact, dopamine release increases particularly during the moments leading up to a potential reward. There it is right there. Dopamine increases during the moments leading up to a potential reward. And I would say, again, the flip side of that is anxiety with increases with the potential disaster, that's just around the corner. And so if you go back and read page 11 of the Gamblers Anonymous combo book, the language specifically talks about all the good things in life that are just around the corner, which means out in the future, after the big win is finally made. And the whole language is about the high. So the high of gambling comes from imagining, jumping into our head, imagining something happening in the future. And that's what I mean when I say we give ourselves the internal affective reward, i.e. the feel good or the dopamine rush, before anything has even happened, just in anticipation of that. Now, do you believe for 1 second, if that's the primary process of a gambler in action, do you believe for 1 second that way of thinking changes once somebody stops gambling? No, it really doesn't. It doesn't at all. And so what's really fun is to work with gamblers who are in recovery, but to keep helping them identify how in their life today they're still thinking like a gambler. And that's one of the characteristics. So he says, again, let me read this. In fact, dopamine release increases particularly during the moments leading up to a potential reward. This anticipation effect, which is another one, anticipation effect, might explain why dopamine release parallels an individual's levels of gambling high and the severity of his or her gambling addiction. It also plays a role in reinforcing the risk-taking behavior seen in gambling. Well, I'm taking a risk because the win is just around the corner. No risk, no reward. And in fact, the bigger the risk, the bigger the fantasy, the bigger the rush. Studies have shown that the release of dopamine during gambling occurs in brain areas similar to those activated by taking drugs of abuse. In fact, similar to drugs, repeated exposure to gambling and uncertainty produces lasting changes in the human brain. These reward pathways, similar to those seen in individuals suffering from drug addiction, become hypersensitive. Animal studies suggest that these brain changes due to uncertainty can even enhance gamblers' cravings and desire for addictive drugs. All right, so what he's talking about is that which we already know, but it bears repeating, is that the more somebody gambles, the more their brain has changed, and so clearly the process of intervention, treatment, recovery is a process of rewiring the neural pathways in the brain. And I don't know, what do they say? It takes, I don't know, what is it, 6 months, 9 months for things to begin to rewire? I may be wrong about that. Somebody, one of you guys, I'm sure, has heard kind of the latest thing on that. So if we know that somebody's in our office with a particular wiring, their neural pathways are set in, again, the fact that they're not gambling does not mean that those neural pathways immediately have changed. And so we help somebody continue to, in effect, I guess, not gamble by continually listening for and identifying how they're representing themselves and their life. What is the language that they use? What's the thought process? What are the feelings? And I continually go back to, so that's like when you were gambling, you would blah, blah, blah. For example, the all or nothing win-lose way of thinking, which is prevalent. And if any of you work with couples, with a lot of addict couples, gambling couples, that's pervasive. And so we simply want to name that. That's the win-lose. That's the win-lose mindset of a gambler, is it not?
Hey, Chris.
Yeah. Shoot.
So just thinking of some things that have happened with a couple of clients here recently, and thinking about that, how the tendency of self-sabotage.
Yeah.
And if people see it coming and see that behavior coming, getting it pointed out, possibly discussing how they may self-sabotage, that could almost be a gamble in and of itself. Would you agree?
I got this. Okay, so wait, say more about that. Clarify a little more so I'm clear on what you're saying.
So I know I'm engaging in behaviors that are part of my cycle.
Okay.
I know they're risking possibly my housing, X, Y, Z, whatever I'm
Okay.
risking here.
Okay.
And I see, I'm discussing them, and yet I'm trapped in my cycle. And I think, and I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think there can be this belief that sometime this will be different, despite the fact that I've engaged in this cycle before, et cetera, that fantasy world thinking that this will be different. And it almost strikes me as similar to gambling in some way, with my outcome.
Yeah. All right. If I'm following you, my first response and what I initially dialed into was the self-sabotage. At that point, I get up and I go to my board and I draw the picture of the hole in the mountain, right? And another way of saying that is helping somebody get to the place of accepting that the way they do their life, I'll use the term guarantees, or it's a setup for living in a constant state of crisis. So crisis, and you know, self-sabotage are choices that we make that undermine ourselves, that create a crisis. Does that make sense? And so,
Yes,
so the crisis is the equivalent of being in the hole gambling. Now, the reason that somebody would be in the hole is because I'm looking for that dopamine rush that comes from anticipating the way out. The deeper the hole, the bigger the crisis, the greater the fantasy, or another way of saying that, the longer and purer the line of cocaine is. And so if I'm addicted, and I think the addiction is to that, is that dopamine reward system has hijacked our brain, and we're looking for ways of continually accessing that dopaminergic reward system. And a great way to do it is for me to dig a hole so that I can fantasize, imagine the way out.
and so
And that
consequently,
is, go ahead.
so consequently, if something happens, whatever it is, something either financially or otherwise, to quote unquote bail me out of the situation, then
Right.
I can perceive that as a win.
Oh, sure. Or even separate from it happening, just imagining it happening.
Right.
Just imagining it happen. And again, you know, we'll go back to page 11 where it says, pathetically, however, there never seems to be a big enough winning to make even the smallest dream come true. When compulsive gamblers succeed, they gamble to dream still greater dreams. So that churning between winning and losing in the hole, the amplitude of that increases and increases over time. And so you see that pattern with gamblers, even though they may not set foot in a casino. You know, it may be way in their rearview mirror. They're continuing to do their life out of that same exact mindset, simply a different arena. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, and then trying to you know, and so part of my goal is, you know, as I've been becoming a gambling counselor, is just getting wind of that this isn't about the stereotypical gambling on the machines or whatever, but starting to see that it exhibits in other areas of their lives and becoming aware of that this is actually a gamble outside of their gambling behavior, and in some cases actually far more deadly. You know, as soon as you're sitting there, I'm thinking, oh, you know, when you're saying it's a cycle and there's a bigger and bigger fantasy and we have to keep generating bigger and bigger fantasies. Right. Well, what's the ultimate risk and what's the ultimate payoff? The whole suicide piece, I wonder. You know, I just took it to that extreme. And can that fit in there? I don't know if I'm on track or not.
Well, certainly, and you know, that would be in other terms, it would be, you know, what in AA they kind of refer to as the dry drunk syndrome. You know, where the addict is still thinking like the addict, even though they might not be using the substance. I think that's accurate, but I don't think it goes far enough. I think what we're talking about is, and what you guys are picking up on or reflecting back, is the importance of recognizing the mind of the gambler at work, even though somebody may not be gambling. And that's I don't know of a better way to say that. There may be, but I'm not sure what it is. So we're always looking for and listening for the mind of the gambler, even as somebody is talking about their recovery process. Because and now here's what happens is that there's a lot of people, and I think we've touched on aspects of this before. You see somebody may stop gambling, they feel great, they're no longer making their life worse by gambling, and they ride that pink cloud for a while. And then there's almost, for most people, an inevitable crash and burn. And you know, what do we do then? And a lot of people, it's, you know, 9 months, a year, you know, go back to gambling or, you know, pick up something else. And so if that way of thinking along the way doesn't change, then I think we can condemn ourselves to doing the same thing over and over again, maybe just in a different arena. That's why it's incumbent upon us as clinicians who are dialed into the gambling to recognize these patterns, even if somebody is not placing a bet at an institution of wagering. And sometimes it's difficult to see, but the more you, I guess, give yourself permission to be aware of it, the more you'll see it, and the more you'll hear it, and the clearer it will become. And what you have then, especially somebody who's got some abstinence, maybe some recovery, it becomes easy then for gambling. You know, what did you tell yourself in your head? Is there any similarity between that and what you're telling yourself today? You know, what's going on today? Because the key piece is that there's still, what I find is that we're still, I'm going to throw myself into the mix, because it took me many years in recovery to begin to figure this out and to begin to understand this, is that the way that I would regulate my internal self was not by drinking or using drugs, but 7 years into recovery, I would jump into my head and I would imagine the way out, or I would imagine a different scenario, and then I would immediately feel good. Or I would imagine something bad happening and I would immediately feel like shit. And then I'd manufacture a countering fantasy or another story where I would end up feeling good. So that pattern that I was doing while I was gambling, I recognized that that's simply the way that I lived in my head, creating different scenarios in the future that then determined how I felt in the moment. Does that sound familiar to you guys? It should, because I think we all do that in one way or another. And so to me, that's the pattern, and that's what this guy is talking about through the lens of gambling. You know, when he uses the term where he talks about the anticipation, and that he says, wait, where's the thing? Yeah. He says, repeated exposure to gambling and uncertainty even change how you respond to losing. Counterintuitively, in individuals with a gambling problem, losing money comes to trigger the rewarding release of dopamine almost to the same degree that winning does. Now, why would that be? The parallel of the ancient version of that description comes in page 10 of the combo book, where it talks about immaturity. I knew I was just on page 10 of the combo book says, I knew I was destroying myself, and yet at the same time I had a certain sense of security. So you ask yourself, wait, how can that be true? So he's kind of coming at that from a researcher looking in from the outside. Counterintuitively, in individuals with a gambling problem, losing money comes to trigger the rewarding release of dopamine almost to the same degree that winning does. Well, that's not exactly right. It's not losing the money that triggers the dopamine. It's the fantasy that I create in the aftermath of losing that triggers the dopamine. So if I was talking to him about this, I would say, well, I'd like to help you clarify what you're observing. It's not the losing that specifically that triggers the release, but it's the losing that sets it up for the person to have the fantasy of the way out, or the anticipation reward. Chris, that is the dopamine rush. Does that make sense, guys?
Chris,
go ahead. Yeah, shoot.
I mean, is it more like, losing keeps the fantasy alive more than winning does?
Well, you have to keep.
Way.
Well, the way that what I hear gamblers say over and over again is that there's more intensity around losing than there is around winning.
More intensity?
More intensity, more emotional intensity around losing than there is about winning. Or they'll say winning is boring. And you're absolutely right. The reason is, I mean, if I win, then yeah, I got to manufacture the fantasy of what I'm going to do with the money that I win.
Right. If I win, I got to pay those bills I'm dreaming about paying.
Well, yeah, and now I got to do something with the money. But you're right that the losing puts one in a position of being in the hole, and you can't be. You're not a hero if you win based on your winnings. You are a hero with the come from behind victory.
Right.
Make sense?
Yeah.
So in order to have a come from behind victory, I have to be losing. And so it's a weird phenomenon, but once we understand that, and so that's why with the people you're working with, what you really want to do is get in their head, help identify, okay, when you lose, what do you say to yourself? When you win, what do you say to yourself? And if you're doing a good job of listening and asking questions, then they will reveal to you what they don't really know, and that is the story they're telling themselves in their head that they don't know they're telling themselves while they're telling themselves. If that made sense, I don't even think I can repeat that. but that's our job to help them become clear. I mean, you're frequently especially among what we refer to as the action gamblers. I mean, I can't tell you how many hundreds or thousands of times I've heard gamblers say winning is boring. Now losing, that's the thing, because now I get to be the hero. Now I get to come from behind victory. You know, now I'm in a position of hitting a home run in the bottom of the ninth with 2 outs, bases loaded, 3-2 count, and 1 crack of the bat, and I won the 7th game of the World Series for us. Well, you can't do that unless you're in the hole to start out with. And so I think it's interesting. Part of how we're wired, I believe, as human beings, is we certainly get more excited, you know, about the close game or the come from behind victory, the blowout. Why? Because there still is that element of uncertainty. If it's a blowout, you know who's going to win, and the only people, I guess, that really care is those who have a wager on the game, and they want to know whether, you know, the team's going to cover or not going to cover. But I think for all of us, a blowout is nowhere near as exciting, you know, as the photo finish. And so that's the phenomenon that we're dealing with. That's part of what this researcher, now he's kind of talking about it as if this is something new. Well, this is absolutely nothing new. You know, we've been talking about this for years, but it is nice to see that that researchers are discovering what we've known for years and used as an essential part of treatment, and they're writing more and more about that. Anyway, that's part one of the things that I had to offer you guys. Any other thoughts on that before we pop to the next theme? All right, so this touches on something that John brought up, and I know we've talked about this before, but it certainly bears repeating. I was in Cleveland. Actually, it was good to see Greta there, and you know, a few other folks from Oregon. Actually, there are a lot of Oregon folks there in Cleveland for the conference. This was the National Council on Problem Gambling annual conference in Cleveland. I guess it was, I don't know, three weekends ago or something like that. But in addition, my friend Richard Rosenthal was there. Now, Richard is he's a psychiatrist. For those of you who don't know, he's a psychiatrist out of Beverly Hills, but he's also co-author of the DSM-4 diagnostic criteria, along with Henry Lessier, who I worked with extensively when I was in Illinois. And I've known Richard for almost 30 years, and it's always fun to see him. And I don't know which time we were talking, but what I was telling him again was that I mean, of the many significant contributions that he's made to the field, one that I think is most significant is an article that he wrote in 1996 that was published in Psychiatric Annals, where he described a fourth stage of gambling addiction. You know, Bob Custer, in his book When Luck Runs Out, adapted the Jellinek chart, and he identified three stages of gambling addiction and the progression of the addiction: winning, losing, and desperation. And in the desperation stage, Bob included suicidality, hopelessness, give up, and a number of other things. And Richard in 96 said, well, you know what, actually, I think those characteristics belong in a fourth stage. And he called that the hopeless or give up stage. And so what's interesting to me, and you guys can kind of make a little mental note of this, is kind of what I watch for is people who are doing training with gambling, whether they're using Custer's V chart with the three stages, or whether they have adapted and incorporated, with now it's what, 30 years old or 20 something years old, the fourth stage or hopeless give up. Now here's the reason this is important clinically, and this is what Richard and I were talking about. The question is, and John, you raised it, is at what point does suicidality become part of the gambler's experience? Now that's a question that's got to be front and center mind for all of us working with this population, knowing the statistics. And I said to you before, if I'm doing my job right, my first session with a gambler, at some point in the session, I'm going to ask them this question. And it's this: how have you decided to kill yourself? And I've said that over the years, and people say, oh, well, you can't ask that. Well, yeah, actually you can. What I'm doing is playing the percentages, because what I know from all the studies, and one that Henry Lessier and I did in 1995 or something, of 180 some odd gamblers in the Chicagoland area, that I believe 18%, is it 8? I haven't looked at this in years, 18 or somewhere around 20% plus or minus, had actually made a suicide attempt. Around 45% had a definite plan to kill themselves. 66% had a suicide ideation. And when Henry and I were putting this together, I said, Henry, we got to ask a fourth question. Now, he had done all the research over the years, and he'd simply stopped at those three questions. He said, what's that? I said, I don't know how to ask this, but I know that for myself, it seemed like on 6-7 years into recovery, I lived with this kind of not daily, but kind of an abiding sense of it wouldn't bother me if I dropped dead today. And I told him, as I talk about that with other gamblers would say, yeah, that's me too. He said, well, let's ask a fourth question and phrase it like this: wanted to die. And so 79% of our respondents answered yes to the question, wanted to die. So now we've got a pie, at least in this sample, and these are confirmed by other studies. 80% of the gambling population that we surveyed, and it was a good sample, 80% were suicidal. So just statistically, I'm on real firm grounds if I'm asking you a question about your suicidality. Now, the reason I ask you, how have you decided to kill yourself, is I'm not suggesting anything to anybody, and it doesn't put anything in anybody's mind. And what happens is people are relieved, because that question is one that in many ways, if you're asking it genuinely, which you guys do, it lets them know that you understand how bad they're hurting. And it's a question that has always gotten a congruent response, except for one case, and I'll tell you about that. People will say that they'll be sometimes kind of startled a little bit or relieved and say, well, no, I wouldn't do that. Okay, well, tell me more. Well, I couldn't do that to my kids. Or no, I haven't thought about that. Say, well, what about What about thoughts of wouldn't bother me if I didn't wake up in the morning? Oh yeah, I think that all the time. So you're asking that question to assess, where they are on the scale of suicidality and to what degree it's an immediate concern. In an intervention, the guy, he was there with a bunch of his friends and business partners, and man, he broke up. It looked like he was decompensating. I thought, oh, something's going on. And it took him about 5 or 10 minutes to kind of compose himself or collect himself and respond. And he said, well, I wouldn't do that because my father killed himself. My father committed suicide. And so me asking, and the fact is he had thought about it, but he had so much shame in thinking about that because he had kids and he couldn't tolerate the idea that he was thinking about doing to himself what his father had done to him in his experience. And so it really took him a while, but it was after we got, after we were able to name that and break through to the other side, I mean, it was a real breakthrough. So here's what Richard and I were talking about. What I said was that in my experience and my observation, as long as I can manufacture the fantasy of the way out, whether it's placing the next bet and winning, whether it's applying for a new credit card to get some money to gamble with, whether it's coming up with the name of somebody else that I can hit up to borrow money, whether it's I've got this bonus coming in at the end of the quarter or whatever it happens to be, as long as I can manufacture the fantasy of the way out, I'm good to go. I may be in the desperation stage, but I'm still chasing. I'm still out there firing away. I'm still operating with the belief that I can place the next bet and win. And I'm not talking about necessarily one bet, but I think you guys follow what I'm talking about. Well, what happens when somebody gets to the point, and not everybody does, of saying, wait a second. It's almost as if at that point, that veil of delusion and denial come crashing down, and we see it for the reality that it is, and we tell ourselves the truth, maybe for the first time. Instead of lying to ourselves, we tell ourselves the truth, and the truth is something like this. If I place the next bet, I will lose. And if I place the next bet and I win, it will not matter because I simply will give that back and then some. My conclusion is there is no way out. Now, I would suggest to you that that is the point where gamblers cross the line into suicidality, the actual suicide attempt or planning. And what we know is, I mean, one of the stories, there was a cop at the tables in a Detroit casino, and this was as this was reported. He was there gambling, and he was losing, and he looked at the dealer and he said, "You're killing me," to the dealer. And he pulled out his gun, put it to his head, and blew his brains out right there at the table. Now, he still had a few bucks left in his pocket. He could have made a few more bets. But I contend that at that moment, what he realized, it's like the lights turned on, the fog cleared. He realized that he couldn't stop, that it didn't matter whether he won or lost the next hand. But he realized that there was no way out. The bridge was out ahead. And he was just hanging on until the inevitable conclusion. Now, he may have had a life insurance policy, and that phenomena is true for everybody I've talked to that has attempted suicide, and I also believe that that's true for people who have succeeded, and it certainly was part of my experience. So the reason this is so important, and the reason that Richard making that distinction between the third and fourth stage, is that if somebody comes into your office and they've crossed over into that fourth stage, they are a hell of a lot easier to work with than somebody who is still in the desperation stage. than somebody who still has the fantasy of the way out. Is this making sense to you guys? What you have to pay attention to is where they are in this progression. Now, the irony of this is that where we want to help people get to is that place of despair, is that place where they recognize that if somebody's in the desperation, my strategy is going to be to help them get to a place of recognizing that it doesn't matter what they do. If they win, they're going to give it all back and then some. And if they lose, they lose. Now, where that's a challenge is, and after we sign off here in a little while, I'm going to be seeing a kid who's in college who's 20 years old, and he plays in the card rooms. And the problem for me in working with an adolescent is the most pain that he has suffered from his gambling is having to deal with his mother being pissed off about having to write some big checks in the thousands of dollars to bail him out from the people that he owes money to that he borrowed from in the card room. He hadn't lost a job. He hadn't lost a license to practice his profession. He hasn't lost anything. And so when you got somebody like that, I mean, you all know that with addiction, as long as the pleasure or the promise of pleasure outweighs the pain, we're going to keep doing it. So how do you intervene on something like that? All right, let me pause for a second because we're talking about the suicidality, talking about the loss of the fantasy. Anybody have any thoughts, responses, questions? Nathan, you there?
Yep.
How you doing? Does this make sense?
Yeah. It seems kind of paradoxical that you want them to go down before you can help them come back up, but it makes a lot of sense.
Well, you're right, and it is paradoxical in a sense. And at the same time, what we know, and if we tap into the wisdom of the 12-step program, first step is we admitted we were powerless and our lives had become unmanageable. What we talk about is addicts needing to hit bottom. So all we do, I can't engineer anybody hitting bottom, number one. Number two, nobody knows what their bottom is until they get past it somewhere down the line and turn around and look back. Number three, for any addict who's still alive, there is no such thing as rock bottom. Because no matter how, and the reason is rock bottom says you can't go any lower. Well, every addict knows you can go lower. So you're right. It is a kind of a paradoxical situation in that I want to help them, ironically, get to a place of despair so that then they can begin to do their lives different. That's kind of the craziness of this. That sounds nuts, doesn't it? And yet, what if you're an addict in recovery or you work, certainly you're working with people, that all of us have to reach some degree of despair with the way things are before we're willing to do anything different. I mean, I had a guy who was 18 years, just talked to him a couple days ago, been working with him for a while, and he had, I think, 18 years sobriety in AA, got very successful businessman, got divorced and started smoking crack. Got himself a young girlfriend who liked smoking crack with him, and so they smoked crack together. Here's a guy who has all this knowledge and experience of sobriety and recovery, and he was kind of Mr. AA in his community. But here he is smoking crack. And he said, he just got out of 8 weeks of inpatient treatment. And he said, what did it for me is I said, I went on a weekend with my girlfriend. We went up to another state, had a great weekend. We were clean and sober, feeling great. And I came back into town and I drove past the airport, and there's where my guy lives. And so I just decided to pick up the phone and call him to see how he was doing. And I said, well, see how he's doing is code for what? And he laughed and he said, well, yeah, that, code for I'm coming by to get some shit from you. So he goes by and picks up some stuff and proceeds to get stoned, and his, gets high, and, his wife and his business partner finally confront him. He's in the middle of a divorce. He says, I tell you what, he says, if I use again, I'm going to go into treatment. He said, but I'm not going to use again. Well, he left the office and that afternoon and went and used and said, okay, that's it. I'm going into treatment. And he and I have been doing a dance around this literally for a year, talking about it. And, when I say that I never know when somebody's going to hit the bottom, I think when you're working with somebody who's active in their addiction, part of our job is simply to walk alongside of them. And again, to hold up the mirror, to play back the tape recorder, but to recognize that we are powerless over their addiction, over engineering their bottom. All we can do is, in a sense, in many ways, and this is maybe counter to what other people say, and that doesn't mean I don't step in to help, but the fact is everybody's got to go through what they have to go through. Now, if somebody's a harm to themselves or others, then, I'm going to step in. But he had to get to a place where his level of despair about himself, I mean, I could tell him until I was blue in the face. But it wasn't until he told himself, I can't stop, or it doesn't matter how many promises I make to myself, I'm just going to break it. Once he confronted himself, then he went into treatment. And so we know that to be true, guys. And so that's our job, is to lead people into that place of recognizing, their own powerlessness. We cannot do that for them. And all the strategies we use, the listening, the challenging, the inviting people to be conscious of their fantasy world, are in service of that. So again, it's important to distinguish where somebody is in their gambling. Are they, and this, one of the ways of looking at stages of change, but it's more specific to where is someone in the progression of their gambling. And I'm guessing, well, not guessing, I know that you all get a number of people in who are still in the desperation stage of their gambling addiction. Is that true? Anybody?
Absolutely true.
Yeah. So that's I would argue that's harder work. And that's why at that point our strategy is to, help get in their heads and really ask them, all right, what happens when you go into the casino? With somebody who's in the hopeless or give up stage, I don't need to do that as much. I may introduce the idea and they say, oh yeah, that's do that all the time. Okay. Now let's identify how you keep doing that. The other thing in recovery, it's important. I mean, I watched people go into gambling treatment, and you guys have seen this. You probably got people in your group today or tonight who create in their own minds the image of being in recovery or the fantasy of being in recovery. And they're feeling really good. Maybe in group, they're feeling really good because they've created or have heard other people talk, and they've created this fantasy of themselves being in recovery, and they walk out the door of group and go get in their car, and life slams them in the face, and then they go crashing down, and they wonder what the hell happened. And so that same mindset, that movement between reality and fantasy, is at play in the recovery process, in the treatment process, with them sitting there in front of you, and it's our job to help identify that. All right, that's a lot for today. Anything else before we? That's what I got for you today. Any other thoughts, responses before we call it a day? All right, guys. The other thing is, I think some of you heard Greta mention this. We're gonna do this. We're gonna switch our time frame to I believe a morning time slot, and Greta's going to be sending an email notice out to everybody in the state, notifying people of our shift in time slot. And it may make it easier for other people to participate. Might make it more difficult for some people, but we'll see. So until next month, you guys are great. I have a tremendous amount of respect for each one of you and the very difficult work you do. And I think it's an honor to get to be in the profession that we're in. So peace. Have a great month and see you next month. Take care.
This conference will now be recorded.